So many stories, Roy. He was the worst and most unathletic person I've ever seen. Never shot a single basket with my dad. I saw him run one time at the church picnic, and I fell over laughing. But he taught us everything. He taught us about love, taught us about family, about trust, about confidence, taught us to enjoy the outdoors, taught us to love the music. But what he mostly taught was how to work hard.
Bill Walton wore tie-dye to a basketball revolution. The Grateful Dead-loving, anti-war protesting, counterculture icon who happened to be the most complete center of his generation. Two-time NBA champion, league MVP, three-time college player of the year, a basketball genius wrapped in contradictions, equal parts peace-loving hippie and ferocious competitor. But don't let the flowers and folk music fool you. Beneath the free spirit exterior was a man with ironclad principles and zero tolerance for those who violated them. Bill Walton was known for his social activism, outspoken opinions, and love of the Grateful Dead rock band. In the 1970s, he was a polarizing anti-government activist. He protested the Vietnam War. He challenged authority. He spoke truth, even when it cost him endorsements and friendships. And that same uncompromising nature that made him a radical. It also made him judge, jury, and executioner when it came to players he couldn't stand. Portland Memorial Coliseum, 1977. Bill Walton is orchestrating the Trailblazers to their only championship, leading the league in rebounding and blocks while threading passes like Magic Johnson in a center's body. During the 1977 NBA Finals, Walton averaged over 18 points, 5 assists, 3 blocks, and an inconceivable 19 rebounds per game. That was peak Walton. Beautiful basketball played with intelligence, teamwork, and fundamental perfection. Everything the game should be. But injury stole his prime. Chronic foot and knee injuries prohibited Walton from enjoying an extended professional career. Years of pain, surgeries, watching his body betray the brilliance of his mind. And through that suffering, Walton developed a sharp eye for players who wasted their health, talent, or integrity on selfish play. He had no patience for selfishness, no tolerance for dirty tactics, no respect for players who prioritized individual glory over team success. Because Walton sacrificed everything, his body, his career, his potential, trying to play the game the right way. So when he saw players cut corners, throw cheap shots, or disrespect the sacred nature of team basketball, that's when the gentle giant became something else entirely. 6 names crossed lines Walton never forgot. Some played dirty when he was already hurt. Others embodied everything wrong with basketball's direction. A few challenged his principles in ways that turned competitive fire into personal contempt. This isn't about playoff battles or championship rivalries. This is about moral violations. Players who didn't just lose Walton's respect, they earned his genuine hatred. And when the most principled player in basketball history admits he hated someone, when a man who preached peace, love, and team basketball draws that line, you know they deserved every bit of it. These are the 6 players Bill Walton hated most. But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe and like this video. It will be very motivation for us. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He never called him the enemy, but Bill Walton didn't have to. The rivalry said it for him. From the moment Walton stepped into the NBA, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wasn't just another opponent. He was the gold standard, the measuring stick, the gatekeeper to greatness. And for Walton, who had arrived from UCLA with sky-high expectations and a national title pedigree, the comparison started immediately. Same school, same position, same lofty vision of what a center could be. But the similarities ended there. Kareem was already a champion, already an MVP. He was reserved, deliberate, and almost mechanical in his dominance. A player who played with surgical precision, not emotion. Walton, by contrast, came in as a passionate idealist, a believer in team harmony and motion offense. He saw basketball as art. Kareem treated it more like a science. That difference in approach, philosophical, emotional, personal, became the foundation of a long-standing tension. And while neither man ever launched open attacks, there was a quiet undercurrent that followed them for years. Walton rarely hid his frustrations, and when he talked about his career, Kareem's name often came with a pause. On the court, their matchups were intense, but largely one-sided. Kareem had the numbers, the size, the longevity. His skyhook, that graceful, untouchable shot, remained out of reach, even for someone like Walton, whose defensive IQ and timing were elite. Walton played him physically, tried fronting, fought through screens, communicated constantly. He made things difficult, but stopping Kareem was almost never in the cards. Even Walton's best defensive efforts often ended with a perfectly arched hook sailing clean over his fingertips. Still, Walton held his ground. He never flinched from the challenge. He embraced it, even when outmatched. And in 1977, when Kareem missed the playoffs and Walton led the Trailblazers to one of the most unexpected championship runs in NBA history, it felt, For a moment, like the balance had shifted. Like the system-first center, the passing wizard, the spiritual successor to Red Holtzman and John Wooden's philosophies, had finally proven something. But that feeling didn't last. The following years were unkind to Walton. Injuries crippled him, surgeries piled up, entire seasons vanished, and as he sat on the bench in suits and walking boots, Kareem kept going, playing 80 games a year, dominating late into his 30s, becoming the NBA's all-time leading scorer. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One career derailed by bad luck and broken feet, the other defined by continuity, control, and almost mythic consistency. And that contrast may have been the root of Walton's resentment, because while he respected Kareem's accomplishments, how could he not? There was a sense, in interviews and commentary, that Walton felt something deeper, that Kareem's greatness wasn't the kind Walton admired. He often praised players like Bill Russell, Nate Thurmond, or Willis Reed, centers known not just for their skill, but their heart, their presence, their connection to teammates. Kareem, by comparison, was distant, not unkind, but detached. He didn't rally the troops, he simply executed. Walton, for all his elegance on the court, was a fiery competitor. He valued joy, movement, shared purpose. And when he looked across at Kareem, the stoic stare, the minimal celebration, the quiet 35 points, it didn't resonate. In fact, it probably irritated him. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about identity. In his mind, Walton had always believed there was a better way to play the game, not just more effective, but more beautiful. And Kareem, year after year, showed that the machine still beat the orchestra, that the soloist still won MVP. Publicly, Walton kept things civil. He'd praise the skyhook, acknowledge Kareem's resume, call him the most skilled scorer ever when prompted. But the warmth wasn't there. And if you listened closely, you'd notice who he didn't mention, who didn't get pulled into the all-time great teammate conversations, whose name was conspicuously absent when Walton described what made basketball meaningful. Even years into retirement, that distance lingered. Part of it may have been Kareem's own demeanor, not hostile, but guarded. He wasn't one to lavish praise, and that included Walton. While Kareem respected Bill's talent, he seldom offered public compliments. And for someone like Walton, who wore his heart on his sleeve, that silence probably said everything. Their careers ended in different lights. Kareem with banners and records, Walton with a clipboard and a limp. But the rivalry, if you want to call it that, remained one of contrast, not explosion. It was two men standing on opposite ends of what basketball could be, one driven by efficiency, the other by soul. And if Walton ever hated Kareem, truly hated him, it wasn't for a dirty foul or a nasty quote. It was for being the reminder of everything Walton couldn't become. Not because he lacked talent, but because his body didn't hold up. Because the system didn't always win. Because sometimes greatness isn't shared. It just looms over you, quietly, steadily, and never says your name. Darryl Dawkins. He called himself Chocolate Thunder, and from the moment he arrived in the NBA, Darryl Dawkins seemed to treat the court as his personal playground. That didn't sit right with Bill Walton. It wasn't just that Dawkins dunked hard. A lot of guys dunked hard, but Dawkins dunked with a mission: to shatter backboards, to humiliate defenders, to make the game loud. He gave names to his dunks like they were songs: the In-Your-Face Disgrace, the Spine Chiller Supreme, the Yo Mama. He wore gold chains, spoke in rhymes, and talked about coming from the planet Lovetron. For Walton, who saw basketball as a brotherhood of trust, motion, and respect, that was too much theater, not enough substance. Their basketball values couldn't have been more different. Walton came from John Wooden's UCLA, built on humility, ball movement, and structure. Every screen had a purpose. Every cut had intention. Dawkins came from the streets of Orlando straight to the NBA without college, the first player to ever do it. He played with raw instinct, unfiltered joy, and a flair that made highlight reels before ESPN even existed. When their teams met, it wasn't just two centers going at each other. It was ideology clashing on the hardwood. Walton didn't hate many players, but with Dawkins, the resentment came not just from what he did, but how he did it. Dawkins would strut after a dunk, pose, wink at the crowd. To Walton, that wasn't passion, that was mockery. And when Dawkins broke backboards, first in Kansas City, then again in Philadelphia, Walton didn't see it as entertainment. He saw it as disrespect. To him, the game was sacred. You didn't showboat. You didn't turn artistry into a stunt. And when someone did, it felt like they were taking something beautiful and turning it into noise. But make no mistake, Dawkins wasn't just a sideshow. At 6 feet 11 inches, nearly 270 pounds, he was a physical force. When he planted under the rim, you couldn't move him. and when he got ahead of steam, most defenders just got out of the way. Walton, of course, didn't. He held his ground, chest up, arms raised. There were collisions between them that sounded like car crashes. Sometimes Dawkins scored, sometimes he didn't. But each impact added to a rivalry that went far beyond the scoreboard. Walton's frustration grew not just from Dawkins' personality, but from how coaches and fans celebrated it. Dawkins wasn't punished for breaking rims. He was mythologized. The NBA reinforced the image. Chocolate Thunder wasn't just tolerated, he was promoted. And to a guy like Walton, who had spent his whole career doing the little things, screening, rotating, communicating, that was maddening. There was one game where Dawkins threw down a dunk so hard that the ball bounced off Walton's shoulder as it came through the net. Dawkins grinned. The crowd erupted, and Walton, stoic and jaw-tight, just ran back down the floor without a word. But inside, he seethed, not because he'd been dunked on, that happens, but because the moment felt like a celebration of chaos, of flash over fundamentals. Years later, Walton would never publicly name Dawkins when asked about rivals, but those close to him knew. If the subject of guys who didn't respect the game came up, Dawkins' name was first. Not because he was malicious. Dawkins was, by many accounts, kind off the court, but because he represented a kind of basketball Walton couldn't accept. They were never destined to be friends. Dawkins was the extrovert, the entertainer, the self-proclaimed ambassador of Lovetron. Walton was the thinker, the teammate, the guy who quoted dead lyrics and memorized Wooden's pyramid of success. And yet, despite the resentment, Walton respected the danger Dawkins posed. You had to game plan for him. You had to get back on defense faster. You had to box out with force, not just form. Because if you didn't, you'd be the next guy on a poster. Or worse, picking glass out of your jersey after another shattered rim. In some ways, Dawkins became the face of everything Walton feared the NBA might become. Flash over teamwork, entertainment over discipline. But in other ways, he forced Walton to confront his own rigidity. The league was evolving, personalities were growing louder, the lines between sports and showbiz were starting to blur, and Dawkins, with all his chaos, color, and charisma, was one of the first to paint outside the lines. Walton didn't have to like it, but he couldn't ignore it, and that's exactly what made it sting. Bob Lanier. He was big, that much was obvious. But Bob Lanier wasn't just tall or heavy. He carried his presence like a threat. The way he filled the lane, the way he moved people without needing to say a word. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Bill Walton wasn't intimidated by many players in his career, but Lanier, that was different. He respected Lanier with a certain edge in his voice, the kind of tone that only came out when he talked about someone who could truly hurt you on a basketball court. Not just beat you, hurt you. Lanier played like a man built for collision. Listed at 6'11" and over 250 pounds, he was one of the few centers in the league who didn't need to wind up or lean into you to make you feel his weight. It was already there. You didn't drive into Bob Lanier's space. You entered it, and then he made you regret it. For Walton, whose game was built on rhythm, anticipation, and timing, Lanier disrupted all of that. He didn't throw elbows out of anger. They came as part of the package. A shoulder in the ribs, a forearm on the back of your neck, feet that always seemed to land where yours wanted to go. It wasn't dirty. It wasn't even personal. It was just Lanier asserting the rules of engagement. This is my zone, and you're not invited. Their matchups were never about flash. There were no dramatic poster dunks or highlight blocks. But what they lacked in theatrics, they made up for in sheer tension. Lanier made Walton play every possession like it mattered. Because it did matter. A moment of hesitation could get you moved out of position. A lazy seal could get your chest caved in. If you came soft, you got punished. And yet, Walton didn't hate Lanier because of anything cheap or underhanded. He hated him the way a boxer hates the guy who always gets up, the one who makes you earn every round. There was something maddening about Lanier's consistency. No matter what you tried, cut-throughs, high post actions, misdirections, he never looked rushed, never got tricked. His balance was legendary. He didn't block a ton of shots, but you rarely got clean looks in the paint. He absorbed your best and calmly gave you back a little worse. What especially gnawed at Walton was that Lanier never gave you an emotional crack to work with. There were no blow-ups, no trash talk, no retaliations, just that steely calm. He'd lay you out with a screen, then help you up. He'd hit you with a body check under the rim, then nod when the whistle blew. He made it hard to hate him for the man he was, which made it even easier to hate him for how helpless he made you feel on the court. And the thing was, Walton's own teammates knew it. There were nights when even Maurice Lucas, the Blazers' bruiser, would give Lanier a wide berth. That's saying something. You couldn't punk him. You couldn't speed him up. You couldn't make it messy, because Lanier didn't play in chaos. He was order, a lumbering, unshakable constant in the middle of the floor. Over time, as Walton transitioned to broadcasting and public speaking, he softened when talking about many of his old rivals. He found poetry in Kareem. He waxed philosophiable about Gilmore. He even found appreciation for the chaos of guys like Dawkins.
Kareem starts catching him, right? And Wilt was fantastic, and Wilt was a huge influence in my life. I've been the luckiest guy in the world.
But Lanier, the tone stayed serious, always. There was reverence there, but also something unresolved. A recognition that this man had owned certain parts of the court Walton had spent his whole career trying to claim. In many ways, Bob Lanier represented the unsolvable problem. He wasn't the tallest. He didn't have Kareem's footwork or Gilmore's reach. But what he had couldn't be schemed around. He was planted, immovable, and to beat him, you had to bring more than just talent. You had to bring pain tolerance. You had to be okay with waking up sore for 3 days straight. You had to accept that, even when you scored on him, you were going to pay a price. Walton hated that, not because he couldn't handle it, but because he had to. Because there was no way around Lanier, only through, and in his prime, even though wasn't enough. In the end, that hate wasn't personal, it was professional. The kind of hate that only exists between men who understand the cost of doing battle the right way. Bob Lanier didn't cheap shot you. He didn't trash talk you. He just met you in the middle and made sure you felt it for the rest of the week. And for Walton, that was enough. Artis Gilmore didn't say much, but he didn't have to. When Bill Walton talked about the most physically imposing players he ever faced, Gilmore's name always came up. Not because of some epic rivalry or explosive playoff moment, but because every time Walton saw that 7'2", 240-pound frame step onto the court, it felt like the temperature in the gym dropped, quiet, cold, and controlled. That was Artis Gilmore, and Walton hated every bit of it. Not in the way he hated showboats or enforcers. This wasn't a Dawkins-style clash of basketball cultures. It wasn't a flash of tempers or bruised egos. It was deeper than that. It was the frustration of facing a man who never blinked, never budged, and never let you see him sweat. Gilmore wasn't just strong, he was disciplined, and for Walton, that made him one of the most suffocating opponents he ever encountered. They were opposites in nearly every way. Walton's game was cerebral, flowing, rooted in motion, passing, and timing. Gilmore was a statue come to life. He didn't roam or react much. He just stood there, taking up more space than should have been humanly possible. Try to post him up, you bounced off. Try to face him up, he'd take away your angle before you even pivoted. Try to outquick him, he didn't need to chase. He waited, and worst of all, he made it look effortless. Most guys who were that physically dominant needed to throw their weight around. They'd grunt, flail, get animated. But Gilmore played like a machine. Quiet footwork, hands always up, perfect defensive stance, every single possession. And it drove Walton insane. There were nights when Walton would run 3 or 4 possessions in a row, curling off screens, hitting cutters, moving the ball, trying to tire Gilmore out. But Artis didn't get tired. He didn't take bait. He just kept standing there like the final boss in a video game. And when Walton finally tried to make his move, a drop step, a spin, a quick flick to the hook, he'd feel Gilmore's hand clamp down on the ball like a steel trap. No call, no complaint, just a possession gone cold. It wasn't just the blocks, it was the denials. The way Gilmore erased angles before they could develop. The way he took away the middle of the floor without lifting a finger. There's a difference between being challenged at the rim and being discouraged from even getting there. Gilmore didn't just stop plays. He made you rethink your entire offensive scheme. Walton could never get comfortable around him. And what made it worse was how Gilmore never gave him anything. No trash talk, no hard fouls, no post-game quotes to circle on the locker room wall. Just silence, silent domination. And that silence messed with Walton's head. Because deep down, Walton wanted the conflict. He needed it. He could handle fights. He could go toe-to-toe with bruisers. But how do you battle a man who doesn't seem to see you as a threat? Who doesn't seem to see you at all? Who just stands there, erasing you from the box score and then walking calmly back to the huddle? Even when Walton would find a moment, maybe a clever bounce pass through traffic, maybe a fadeaway that kissed glass just right, Gilmore never reacted. No scowl, no nod, just reset. What truly made Walton resent Gilmore, though, wasn't just the physical difficulty. It was the psychological dominance. He made you feel like you weren't part of the game plan, like you were just another task to be managed, like your very identity as a skilled, smart, high IQ center didn't matter. That's the part that stung the most, not being beaten, being dismissed. Years later, Walton would still speak about Gilmore with a kind of reluctant awe. He'd call him one of the most fundamentally sound defenders I ever played against. He'd praise the footwork, the discipline, the stillness. But the way he said it, flat, resigned, told you how much it still bothered him. Because for all the bruises and blows Walton took from guys like Lanier or Gilmore's teammate Dawkins, it was Artis who made him feel the most helpless. It was Artis who showed him what it meant to be outclassed in silence. Not through violence, not through swagger, just presence. And sometimes, presence is the hardest thing to beat. But when the opponent was Sidney Moncrief, it wasn't about strength or size, it was about survival. Walton didn't hate Moncrief in the traditional sense. He didn't see a dirty player or a trash talker. What he saw was a problem, relentless, detailed, almost surgical in how he attacked your rhythm. And that's what drove Walton crazy. Because Moncrief didn't just disrupt plays, he disrupted identities. He was only 6 feet 3 inches, a compact guard from Arkansas, but he played with a kind of defensive intention that few ever matched. It wasn't just energy, it was obsession. Moncrief studied your tendencies. He knew the timing of your plays, the footwork of your guards, even the shoulder fakes of your wings. And he used all of it, not for the highlight steal or the loud block, but to make you uncomfortable from the opening tip. Walton hated that. He loved basketball played with flow, with interconnected passing, system-driven spacing, and rhythm that built possession by possession. That's what he lived for. But when his teams ran into Moncrief's bucks, all that structure evaporated. Moncrief didn't just break the first action, he erased your counters, your delays, your improvisation. He forced your offense to become something it wasn't built to be. There were no shortcuts. If you wanted a clean possession against Moncrief, you had to work for it. Every screen, every pivot, every read. And even then, it rarely felt clean. Walton would later say that Moncrief was the best defensive guard I ever saw, and that wasn't just praise, it was memory steeped in exhaustion. Because when Moncrief was on the floor, you couldn't coast. If you jogged a cut, he'd beat you to the spot. If you floated a pass, he'd deflect it. If your guard tried to lull him with hesitation dribbles, Moncrief wouldn't bite. He'd wait, study, and then pounce when it counted. It was like playing chess with someone who already knew your second and third moves, and he didn't need to be dramatic about it. That was the part that stuck with Walton. No yelling, no antics, just high-level execution over and over for 48 minutes. When Walton's Celtics faced those Bucks teams in the early 80s, he dreaded how Moncrief could throw off the entire balance of the game. Not by dominating the scoreboard, but by forcing his team to abandon what they practiced. He made coaches scrap their playbooks mid-game. He made offenses devolve into isolation and panic. It wasn't chaotic exactly. It was more precise than that. It felt like compression, like Moncrief shrunk the court by sheer will. It wasn't just one-on-one. Moncrief elevated everyone defensively. His rotations were sharp, his communication constant. When he jumped a passing lane or recovered to contest a shooter, it set the tone. You could feel the shift. Even seasoned veterans began rushing their decisions just to avoid his presence. What made it worse, from Walton's view, was that you rarely caught Moncrief out of position. He almost never bit on fakes. Rarely could you bait him into unnecessary fouls. Blowing by him was difficult, unless you had elite quickness, and even then, the recovery angle was often waiting for you. There was no panic, just anticipation. And if you thought you could beat him by attacking off the ball, good luck. He fought through screens like they owed him money. Whether it was a baseline double or a flare screen at the top, he trailed shooters like it was personal. Walton marveled at it. He respected it, but he also hated having to face it, because it wasn't just defense, it was disruption. Fundamental disruption, and that bled into everything. The flow of the offense, the spacing, the timing, even the confidence of your primary ball handler. If your guard wasn't mentally locked in, Moncrief could reduce him to a bystander within a quarter. Years later, Walton would recall those Bucks teams and how they played connected basketball, but you could tell what lingered for him wasn't the offensive sets or the rebounding battles. It was the memory of Moncrief, shadowing every movement, erasing advantages before they began. And that's the difference. Some players beat you with flair, others with brute strength. But Moncrief, he beat you with friction, the kind that wore you down before the scoreboard even reflected it. Walton never forgot that feeling, of trying to run a simple post entry and watching it get deflected, of watching his teammates delay cuts because Moncrief was lurking, of looking to the bench, searching for a plan B and realizing Moncrief had already taken that away too. He didn't hate Moncrief the man, he hated what Moncrief did to the game he loved. There's a famous story Walton once told in passing, that Hayes never set a good screen in his life. It sounds flippant, like a throwaway jab, but in Walton's basketball worldview, that wasn't a joke. It was an indictment. To Walton, setting a screen was the ultimate selfless act, sacrificing your body to get a teammate open. It required timing, trust, and commitment to the team concept. If Hayes couldn't even do that, what else was he faking? Their styles clashed violently. Hayes was more brute force than ballet. He loved the left block, loved to pound the ball, loved to spin into that fadeaway that had become his trademark. He didn't move with the grace of a Kareem or the agility of a Lanier, but he didn't need to. He just forced the issue, shot after shot, possession after possession. He averaged over 18 shots per game in his career and rarely passed out of double teams. To Walton, that wasn't just inefficient, it was selfish, and it wasn't just about stats. It was the vibe Hayes carried on the court. He rarely smiled, rarely engaged. He could rack up 30 and 15, but if you asked his teammates afterward what kind of night it was, they'd shrug. He played through the game, not with it. That burned Walton, because for a guy like Bill, who felt every bounce of the ball as something sacred, Hayes represented the opposite, an individualist cloaked in team colors. Their duels in the paint were physical, but never personal in the traditional sense. Hayes didn't talk trash. He didn't need to. He had elbows and shoulders and a relentless motor, but he also had a way of drifting when games got tight, avoiding the contact, shying from the moment. And for all of Hayes' rebounding and defense, Walton felt he never owned the clutch. He filled the box score, but left a vacuum in the heart of the game. That perception only deepened in 1978, when the Washington Bullets, with Hayes anchoring the front court, won the NBA title. Walton was injured that season, and his Blazers had stumbled out of contention. But even from the sidelines, he watched the Bullets play and couldn't understand how they'd won with Hayes. He respected Wes Unseld, his screens, his grit, his passing. But Hayes, he was still hunting numbers. Later, when Walton was with the Celtics, he'd be asked about the great forwards he faced. He'd name Maurice Lucas, Bobby Jones, even guys like Dennis Autry or Paul Silas. Hayes almost never came up. Not because he wasn't good, but because he wasn't meaningful. To Walton, greatness wasn't just scoring points. It was how you scored them, who you lifted when you did. Hayes didn't lift, he loaded. And yet, maybe that's what made the hate so enduring. Because you don't hate someone forgettable. You hate someone who could have mattered more, who had the tools, the body, the resume, but chose not to lean into the spirit of the game. Walton knew what greatness could look like. He'd played with it, he'd sacrificed for it. And when he looked at Hayes, he saw a man content to chase shadows, not light them. Walton never outright trashed Hayes in interviews. He was too professional, too gracious. But the tone always shifted. The praise never came. And that, in Walton's world, was the clearest sign of disrespect. Elvin Hayes wasn't just a player Walton didn't admire. He was a player who stood for everything Walton rejected, and that made the hate permanent. So here we conclude the list. Share your thoughts in comments section. And also, do not forget to like the video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more future videos.